the day the US dollar died, and nobody noticed. The world's strongest currency didn't die with an explosion. It died quietly on a Sunday evening in front of millions of television sets. For decades, people around the world believed the US dollar was unshakable, backed by the largest gold reserves and the unstoppable power of the American economy. But that strength was replaced by something else, something hidden. When the dollar lost its golden anchor in 1971, it didn't stay afloat by miracle or luck. It survived because of oil. In secret meetings and quiet deals, the United States forged a pact that would tie the dollar's future not to gold in vaults, but to barrels of crude half a world away. The moment the dollar was no longer backed by metal, it became backed by energy and by a geopolitical bargain few understood. Since that night, every bill in your wallet, every price tag, and every debt has been running on a kind of collective faith, a belief built on oil, power, and trust. It's hard to imagine today, but there was a time when every US dollar was quite literally a claim to gold held in American vaults. Gold was the foundation for trust, and trust was everything. If you held a dollar, you could redeem it for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, a guarantee backed by the Treasury and the greatest economic power of the post-war era. That standard gave the world stability. It meant nations could trade with confidence, knowing the value of money was tied to something real. By the late 196s, that promise was under threat. America was spending more than ever before on a distant war in Vietnam, on an ambitious space race, on a sweeping social agenda at home. Countries like France began to suspect that the US was printing more dollars than it could possibly cover in gold. One by one, nations lined up to cash their paper for metal. It was as if the world's biggest bank started to run out of deposit. Then came August 15, 1971. With inflation climbing and gold reserves draining, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation. His speech lasted just about 15 minutes, but those 15 minutes rewrote global finance. He didn't call it the end of the gold standard. He called it a temporary suspension of convertibility, a pause meant to stop speculators. But there was no return. The temporary measure became permanent, and the old system died right there, in prime time. That single decision, made in a scramble to protect the American economy, changed how every country operates. It untethered money from the most trusted object in history and replaced it with a new idea. Money was whatever government said it was. Prices, savings, loans, and wages all would now float on confidence alone. The dollar didn't fall apart outright, but it transformed. It became a belief system, not a physical guarantee. That shift set off a chain reaction. Currencies around the world started to drift freely in value. Inflation surged, and developing nations, borrowing heavily in dollars, found themselves at the mercy of decisions made in Washington. Even today, when your paycheck buys a little less or the price of groceries creeps higher, you're still feeling aftershocks from that 1971 moment. And yet the dollar appears stronger than ever. It dominates world trade, oil contracts, and foreign reserves. It's treated as if no force could ever dethrone it. But behind the curtain lies a fragile truth. When the dollar left gold, its strength stopped coming from metal. It started coming from trust. Trust in a government to manage debt, trust in economies to keep using it, trust that nothing better will come along. That's what makes this history so strange and so critical. The US dollar didn't collapse. It evolved. Its power wasn't destroyed, but rebuilt on something far more human and volatile: belief. This is the story of how the world's most trusted currency died, revived itself through oil and politics, and became a pillar built on perception. To understand why nearly every nation still plays by America's rules, and why that might not last forever, we have to go back to where the dollar's power began, when it was made of pure gold. The birth of the dollar's power. Picture the world in 1944. Europe lay in ruins, cities bombed out, factories silent, currencies worthless. People traded cigarettes and canned food because national money meant almost nothing. Amid that devastation, the United States stood apart, its economy intact, its gold vaults overflowing. Roughly 3/4 of all the world's gold sat in Fort Knox and the New York Federal Reserve. That mountain of metal gave America unmatched leverage when the great powers met to redesign the global economy at a small resort in Bretton, New Hampshire. There, representatives from 44 nations met for weeks of negotiations that felt more like financial nation-building than diplomacy. The world's economies needed stability, trust, and a way to rebuild. So the delegates made an unprecedented decision: tie every major currency to the US dollar and tie the dollar itself to gold. It was a simple, elegant structure. 1 ounce of gold would equal 35 US dollars. Every other currency, pounds, francs, yen, would peg itself to the dollar at a fixed rate. The arrangement turned Washington into the financial hub of the planet. The reasoning seemed bulletproof. The US had more gold than anyone. Its economy produced half of the world's industrial output. Its military guaranteed post-war security. If any country could be trusted not to debase its currency, surely it was America. So the dollar became a kind of global insurance policy. A French company could sell wine to Britain, get paid in dollars, and sleep soundly knowing that those dollars could always be converted to gold if necessary. Confidence in the dollar meant confidence in trade. And for the first time in history, nearly the entire world economy ran through one nation's currency. By the late 194s and early 195s, the arrangement worked beautifully. Dollars flowed from the US into Europe through the Marshall Plan, helping to rebuild destroyed infrastructure and kickstart growth. Every shipment of machinery or steel that left New York or Detroit strengthened the dollar's grip. From Tokyo to London, each country's central bank stored dollars in its reserves as a kind of lifeline. To have dollars was to have access to global commerce, oil, and technology. The Golden Era made money feel almost mathematical. Each nation's currency moved within narrow limits against the dollar, with minor adjustments now and then. If a country's economy overheated or cooled, its central bank intervened using its dollar reserves to maintain the peg. The International Monetary Fund, created alongside the Bretton Woods system, acted like a referee to keep everyone honest. It all seemed orderly, almost scientific, a welcome change after decades of depression and war. But beneath that stability, something subtle was happening. The system depended on one enormous assumption, that the United States would always be able to supply dollars without losing its gold. At first, this wasn't a problem. The US had a trade surplus, meaning more goods were leaving than entering, and dollars were scarce outside America. But as Europe and Japan rebuilt, they began exporting more products to the US. Dollars accumulated abroad faster than gold could justify. In other words, the world was swimming in paper promises, while the metal behind those promises stayed put. Still, faith in America was so strong that few questioned it. If anything, the abundance of dollars became the lubricant of global growth. Every government wanted them. Every major contract, from cars to copper to crude oil, was denominated in dollars. Even countries with little direct trade with the US measured their exports in American currency. This alignment of gold, paper, and power created the first modern form of financial empire, one held not by colonies but by currency. Meanwhile, lawmakers in Washington viewed this dominance as proof of their nation's exceptionalism. They believed the rest of the world would eternally need American dollars and would therefore support whatever level of spending the US chose. And so began a pattern that would later prove fatal to the system, confidence turning into complacency. During the 195s, the US started spending heavily to maintain its global influence through foreign aid, military bases, and early Cold War commitments. Money flowed outward faster than gold flowed in. By the early 196s, some European economists began muttering about what they called the dollar overhang, the growing mismatch between the number of dollars in circulation and the gold available to back them. But for most policymakers, the idea of a dollar crisis was almost unthinkable. The dollar was America's national symbol. It was printed with patriotic assurances. In God we trust, and circulated in vast quantities around the planet. To everyday people, it appeared invincible. Even as small cracks began to appear, small fluctuations in exchange rates, slight inflation in consumer prices, the system carried on, buoyed by reputation and inertia. Yet history always finds weak points. The Bretton Woods arrangement had locked exchange rates in a world that was rapidly changing. Industrial recovery in Europe and Asia meant America could no longer dominate trade as easily as before. To stay competitive, other nations wanted flexibility, the ability to adjust their currencies more freely. But the system's biggest flaw came from inside the United States itself, the temptation to print more money to cover rising costs. The 196s brought enormous spending. The moon landing project demanded billions. The Vietnam War drained even more. Domestic programs designed to fight poverty and expand welfare added layers of expense. Rather than raise taxes, politicians simply issued more dollars. On paper, the US promised that each one could still be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. In practice, that promise was becoming impossible to keep. Foreign governments noticed. Some started to quietly redeem their growing piles of dollars for gold. Britain did it first in 1965. Then France famously sent a warship across the Atlantic to collect its share, a theatrical reminder that paper and promises were no substitute for coins in the vault. Each shipment out of Fort Knox shrank America's reserves and amplified nervous whispers in global market. Even so, the illusion held for a while. Most countries preferred to keep their dollars because trade depended on them, and holding gold earned no interest. The US reassured its allies that everything was fine, that gold reserves were sufficient, that confidence must be maintained. They were half right. Confidence was indeed the foundation, but it was starting to wobble. By the end of that decade, economists everywhere sensed the drift. The dollar was still as good as gold, officially speaking. But insiders knew that stability rested on math that no longer worked. More dollars existed abroad than could ever be redeemed. What began as an unbreakable monetary order was slowly turning into a global balancing act sustained by faith alone. And yet at that point, most of the world remained unaware. To everyone else, the dollar was still untouchable. That illusion of control, carefully built since Bretton Woods, was about to meet its first real test. The cracks were spreading through the golden promise, and one major shock away lay the decision that would end it entirely. Cracks in the golden promise. By the mid-196s, the world's confidence in the dollar was still strong publicly. Behind closed doors, however, it was eroding fast. The United States had stretched itself thin. The same government that had promised to protect the planet from communism was also trying to conquer poverty at home, win the space race, and maintain an expensive network of military bases around the world. Dollars flowed out in every direction. Gold did not. Each year, the gap widened. By 1968, the U.S. owed foreign governments and investors more than $40 billion, yet held barely $10 billion worth of gold. On paper, it could have worked if everyone simply agreed not to cash in. But of course, they did cash in. Confidence in money depends on the belief that it can be converted into something real. And when that belief wavers, people start testing it. European allies became some of the first to do so. In Paris, President Charles de Gaulle openly mocked the system. He accused Washington of enjoying an exorbitant privilege. It could print money to pay for foreign goods, while the rest of the world had to earn theirs through trade. He wanted out. In 1965, France began redeeming dollars for gold, and not just discreetly. It sent an entire naval ship to New York loaded with paper currency to be swapped for bullion. The message was clear. The world no longer trusted the American promise at face value. Other nations soon followed. West Germany, Switzerland, and Japan quietly began redeeming dollars as well. Each request forced gold out of American vaults and made the next request more likely. It was a silent run on the bank that everyone pretended wasn't happening. The U.S. Treasury scrambled to reassure nervous partners, releasing periodic statements about ample reserves and fair confidence. But inside the Federal Reserve, the arithmetic looked increasingly grim. For every ounce of gold left, thousands of paper dollars existed. The imbalance was irrefutable. All of this pressure came at a time when the American public was feeling the economic strain too. Prices of everyday goods crept upward, wages barely kept up. The war in Vietnam was costing billions each month, but bringing no clear victory. Domestic spending kept climbing, fueled by new welfare programs and infrastructure projects. Yet few politicians had the nerve to suggest raising taxes or cutting military budgets. The easier path was to keep printing. The printing presses in Washington became the lungs of an empire trying to do everything at once. The result was predictable: too many dollars chasing too few goods. Inflation began to rise slowly at first, then steeply by the end of the decade. By 1969, consumer prices were climbing at more than 5% a year, high for a generation that had grown used to stable prices. The government responded with partial wage controls, temporary freezes, and statements insisting that the fundamentals were strong. But investors and foreign governments could read the numbers. The gold reserve was shrinking month after month. Unbeknownst to most Americans, high-level meetings were taking place across Washington to figure out how to stop the bleeding. Officials debated ways to make the dollar more competitive, maybe raising the gold price, maybe imposing trade restrictions, maybe persuading allies to hold on to their paper assets just a bit longer. Each idea carried massive risks. Changing the gold price would look like a confession of weakness. Trade restrictions would anger Europe. Diplomatic begging would only spread rumors. There was no clean exit. Meanwhile, the global press picked up on small but telling signs. Financial newspapers reported unusual gold movements from Fort Knox. Rumors spread that the U.S. might secretly close the gold window altogether. The Treasury denied it repeatedly. But inside the White House, economic advisors were split. Some said, "Hold the line, reassure the world." Others argued, "If we keep paying out gold, we'll have none left by the end of the year." The line between stability and collapse was narrowing by the week. By 197, the dollar began to lose its aura. For the first time since World War II, foreign exchange markets showed clear signs of doubt. Traders started betting against the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Central banks spent heavily trying to maintain it, but the tide was turning. Even ordinary citizens in other countries began converting dollars into marks or francs. Everyone wanted assets that looked more solid than the greenback. Inside Congress, the issue barely registered as a full-blown crisis. Politicians were focused on domestic concerns, rising prices, falling approval ratings, an unpopular war. Most didn't realize that the global order built in 1944 was on life support. The average American still thought of the dollar as invincible. Newsreels showed stacks of gold bars gleaming under floodlights at Fort Knox, filmed intentionally to project eternal stability. Those images hid the uncomfortable truth that much of that gold was already spoken for by overseas claims. By the time Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969, the situation had reached a quiet emergency. He inherited an economy that looked fine on the surface, but was hemorrhaging credibility abroad. In private, his Treasury Secretary warned that foreign central banks were within months of draining Fort Knox beyond recovery. Nixon's political instincts told him that a visible devaluation or gold restriction would signal defeat and trigger panic. Yet standing still would let the crisis fester. Behind the scenes, Nixon's team explored last resort options. One proposal suggested temporarily suspending gold redemption just for a few weeks to cool speculation. Another offered to raise the official gold price to around $42 an ounce, effectively admitting that the dollar had lost value. But every potential fix either harmed America's reputation or risked global backlash. The administration needed a decision that appeared strong and temporary, but that, in practice, would change everything. All through 1971, the numbers worsened. Foreign claims on American gold exceeded what the Treasury could deliver. Speculators shorted the dollar, central banks hoarded gold, and panic began to simmer. In the first half of that year alone, nearly $3 billion in gold left U.S. reserves. Diplomats from Europe demanded emergency consultations. Japan requested clarity on future exchange rates. It felt like a run on national credibility. In the summer of 1971, news reached Washington that Britain was about to request a massive gold conversion, one that the U.S. probably couldn't fulfill without exposing its weakness. The president's advisors sounded the alarm. Either close the gold window now or risk an outright financial collapse. The choice was stark. Preserve the illusion of stability by ending convertibility, or let the illusion destroy itself. Nixon, ever conscious of how things looked on television, knew he had to act decisively and publicly. He prepared what would become one of the most consequential addresses in modern history. Still, he framed it as a measure of strength, not desperation. The world would learn about it not from rumors or leaks, but from a live announcement broadcast on a Sunday evening. And so, as the summer heat settled over Washington and the pressure built to unbearable levels, one man prepared to do the unthinkable. The United States, the country that had guaranteed the world's monetary order for a generation, was about to pull the plug on its own promise. The cracks in the golden system had widened into fractures no amount of reassurance could repair. What began amid triumph at Bretton Woods was now ending in quiet disbelief. The hour had come for the president to make his move. The night Nixon broke the system, August 15, 1971, a humid Sunday evening in Washington. Americans gathered in front of television sets expecting the usual nightly news, commercials, maybe a baseball score. Instead, the program was interrupted. A solemn image appeared. President Richard Nixon seated behind his desk in the Oval Office, an American flag to one side, the presidential seal gleaming behind him. His words, calm and measured, would end a global system that had held the world together for a generation. Earlier that month, Nixon had retreated with his top economic team to Camp David for what they called an economic summit. The group included Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and a handful of trusted aides. They brought piles of charts showing the same alarming message. Gold reserves were evaporating, inflation was rising, and foreign governments were demanding more redemption than the Treasury could supply. Connally, a Texan known for blunt talk, reportedly said, "Mr. President, the world is draining our gold and laughing at us while they do it." Few in that room disagreed. Behind the calm setting, panic lingered. Britain's government had just requested to exchange large sums of dollars for gold, enough to cut remaining reserves in half. Economists warned that if Britain got its shipment, other nations would line up next, leaving America essentially bankrupt. The Bretton Woods Foundation was collapsing in slow motion, and no one could stop it with polite diplomacy. Nixon's instinct was to take control before events humiliated his administration. He wanted to appear decisive, not desperate. At Camp David, the group debated options into the night. Should they devalue the dollar, freeze wages, blame foreign nations? Each idea came with political risk. Nixon was approaching re-election season and feared anything that smelled of economic weakness. Finally, after hours of argument, Connally proposed an unprecedented combination: close the gold window completely, impose a temporary freeze on wages and prices, and slap a 10% tax on imports to protect American industry. It was a mix of boldness and nationalism, tailor-made for television. The president asked if such a move would be legal. Connally's half-joking answer summed up the attitude in the room. "It's legal if you say it is, Mr. President." The message was clear: lead first, justify later. By Sunday morning, they had their decision. The United States would stop converting dollars into gold, temporarily, to protect its currency and jobs. The economists in the room knew it wasn't temporary. Once the door closed, there was no reopening it without chaos. But the words softened the blow and gave the illusion that this was an emergency measure, not the end of an era. Nixon rehearsed the speech several times that day. He understood the stakes: the nation's trust in its money, its credibility abroad, and his own political legacy. Television cameras were set up in the Oval Office that evening. The broadcast interrupted the popular Western series Bonanza, ensuring maximum attention. When Nixon began speaking, his tone was steady, even reassuring. He framed the situation as a patriotic defense of America against international money speculators. Few watching realized that those speculators included central banks of allied nations. He announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices to stamp out the menace of inflation. Then came the crucial line: "I have directed Secretary Connally to temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." It sounded almost routine, just another policy adjustment. But those words quietly tore the final link between paper money and the metal that had underpinned global trust for centuries. Inside the Treasury, officials listening live understood instantly. Some applauded, others felt sick. Decades of economic orthodoxy had just been flipped inside out. The United States had promised every dollar could be traded for gold at $35 an ounce. That promise was now void. The dollar was officially a fiat currency, backed by nothing but the credit and faith of the U.S. government. Abroad, the reaction was instant disbelief. European finance ministries scrambled through the night, calling emergency meetings. In London, dealers described the next morning's gold market as bedlam. Prices shot upward within hours. By midweek, exchanges closed temporarily to digest the shock. The Smithsonian Agreement, signed only months later as a patch-up fix, would attempt to restore fixed rates, but by 1973, even that would crumble. The world's currencies were now adrift. Nixon's team celebrated publicly. Stock prices jumped, and opinion polls surged in his favor. On the surface, the announcement looked like a patriotic masterstroke. Factories cheered the import surcharge. Wage earners liked the idea of a freeze that promised relief from rising prices. Newspapers splashed headlines like "NIXON takes action to defend the dollar." The White House carefully framed it as strength, not surrender. But behind the triumphal images, something fundamental had changed: money itself. In the weeks following the announcement, the psychological adjustment began. Foreign governments realized that their hoards of dollars, once guaranteed claims on U.S. gold, were now simply paper assets. They could no longer demand anything tangible in exchange. The privilege of printing the world's reserve currency had transformed into a power based entirely on trust. America had defaulted in all but name. For everyday citizens, the change wasn't immediately visible. They still used the same bills, bought groceries with the same notes, collected paychecks with the same symbols, but prices began creeping upward. Gold, once frozen at $35 an ounce, leapt to nearly $45 within months and kept climbing. That reflected not just inflation, but the market's realization that the anchor was gone. Internationally, allies felt betrayed. West Germany called the move economic warfare. France's finance minister compared it to a declaration of independence from responsibility, yet none could do much about it. They needed access to American markets and credit, and soon, as oil prices rose and debts mounted, the world would need dollars more than ever. Ironically, by breaking its promise, the United States strengthened its currency's dominance.